it as we go along. But again, welcome to this fixed point discussion of this book, The Brothers Karamazov. And if you're not familiar with I'd have just done something else wrong here. Well, hopefully not. But anyway, the Brothers Karamazov, I taught Russian literature for a number of years. I have a master's degree in Russian history. And this book, I love it. It's a fascinating book. And it's one that is considered to be one of the greatest books of all time. And it has quite a story to it and quite a lot behind it. Certainly an awful lot of content. And let me give you just a little bit of Russian history before we get started, because in order to really fully appreciate Russian literature, you need to know a little bit about Russian history and the Russian mindset, which is so very different from a Western and especially in a mindset. There's always been this tension in Russian history between Westernizing and remaining true to a Russian mentality, what are referred to as the Slavophiles, the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. Let me give you just a little glimpse of what that looks like in Russia's history, just among Russia's czars and czarinas. Catherine the Great came to the throne in 1762, and she ruled until 1796. She was a Westernizer. She was followed by her son, Paul. Tsar Paul ruled from 1796 to 1801. He was a Slavophile, so he tried to undo everything that his mother did to Westernize. Paul died in 1801. He's followed by his half-brother, Alexander I, who was a Westernizer. He ruled from 1801 to 1825, during the Napoleonic Wars. He appears in Tolstoy's War and Peace. He's followed by his half-brother, Nicholas I. And Nicholas the First, I don't know what's happening to my screen here, but something odd. But anyway, Nicholas I ruled from 1825 to 1855 during the Crimean War. He was a Slavophile, so he went back in the other direction. So you're really seeing this. He died as I say, in 1855. He's followed by his son, Alexander II, who ruled from 1855 to 1881. He is referred to as a Westernizer, the liberator czar. He liberated the peasants, their equivalent of slaves. And he was blown to bits in an assassination in 1881. But again, a Westernizer. He's followed by Tsar Alexander III, who was a Slavophile, so went back in the other direction again. He ruled from 1881 until 1894, and he was followed by Nicholas, and he was definitely a Slavophile, and he was followed by the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, who was also a Slavophile. So you see this tension, this extraordinary tension between Westernizing or remaining very Russian. And Dostoevsky was himself a Slavophile. He did not like the West. He didn't like the materialism of the West. He's a bit of in the 20th century, an equivalent to Dostoevsky, I think, is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If you've ever read any Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Solzhenitsyn was also something of a Slavophile. He said that to be exiled from Russia was for him literary death. Because it was that environment that fed him and fed his writing. Dostoyevsky was born in 1821, and he died in 1881, as I recall. He'd intended the Brothers Karamazov to be a trilogy. And I will tell you, for my students of Russian history, they must have been very glad indeed that the man died before he could finish volumes 2 and 3, because as you can see, it is quite formidable. And superficially, well, before I get to that, a little bit about him. Dostoevsky was born of minor nobility, and as opposed to, say, Tolstoy, who belonged to the highest of the high nobility. He had rights to call it court, for instance. He could call on the Tsar if he wanted to. Dostoyevsky was of minor nobility, but nobility nonetheless. His father was murdered by his peasants. And Dostoevsky himself became an atheist and a strong believer in socialism. And if you read this book, for those of you who've read it or who might be in the process of reading it, you will see that for Dostoevsky, atheism and socialism go together. I've written in my book, if you see the curtains moving, this is my German Shepherd walking around, looking out, and seems like he's about to start barking at dogs out here. But anyway, Dostoevsky believed that the two went together, and I wrote in my book the Grace Effect, that socialism is atheism masquerading as political philosophy. Indeed, it is. Socialism, as Dostoevsky points out, towards the beginning of the book, he makes the statement that socialism is an attempt to build it on earth. It's the Tower of Babel, as he says, built without God, not to go from earth to heaven, but to bring heaven down to earth. It's a utopian philosophy, and it's a utopian philosophy that Dostoevsky passionately believed in until 1849. And in 1849, he was arrested. He was a part of a revolutionary group called the Purification Circle, and the Purification Circle planned to kill the Tsar. And he, along with the rest of the group, they were rounded up. They were all sentenced to death. And as they're taken to the stake to be shot, they're lined up, and the commander, says to the soldiers, "Ready, aim." At the last second, someone rushes in with a decree and says, "Wait, wait, wait. The Tsar has commuted the sentences." Now, this was a mock execution. It was meant to terrify these young men, and indeed it did. And Dostoevsky says that as they were walking to the stake, he says that he reverted to the Russian orthodoxy of his youth. And he said to another member of this revolutionary group, he said, "Today we shall be with Christ." And the other man pointed at the ground and he said, "Nothing but dust." So there you see the tension between belief and unbelief as they're about to be executed. Dostoevsky says in that moment, the ready, aim, wait. He said that the old man died and the new man was born. He was instead sentenced to, if memory serves, 10 years hard labor in Siberia. And as you can well imagine, 10 years of hard labor in Siberia, in Russia, is hard labor in Siberia. Kolyma, for instance, a section of Siberia, it's not even the whole of Siberia. Kolyma is 3 times the size of France. And it's a section that was dotted with what Solzhenitsyn called the Gulag Archipelago, just islands, as it were, of prison camps that well into the 20th century, and undoubtedly even today, just in some modified fashion. So Dostoevsky spent his time there, and while he was in prison, he was allowed one book, and that was Testament. And he read it, and he read it, and he read it, and he read it. And Russians have developed, Russia's a third world country in everything except for secret police and torture. They've learned these things quite well throughout the centuries, so that they've become among the best in the world at both. Dostoevsky received something called the silent treatment, which now is done with technology, but where he was put alone in isolation, and where his guards wore felt bottom boots so that he would never see or hear anyone. No one ever spoke to him. Food just appeared. But he was denied all interaction with human beings. And you can imagine the effect that this begins to have on you. Your mind begins to feed on itself. And Dostoevsky developed frontal lobe epilepsy. After he got out of prison, he returned back to the West, that is to say, Western Russia. And he began writing, and he would dedicate the rest of his life to writing against the very things that he had once. So hold on one second. I think someone else is trying to get in. And yes, let me help this poor woman. He would dedicate the rest of his life to writing against the very things that he had been devoted to, and that is socialist theism. And if you were to read his major works, you know that this is a theme that runs through them all. The idiot, the possessed, or demons, as it's sometimes translated. The Brothers Karamazov, and punishment. These are themes that run straight through them all. And in the tension in these books always deals with belief in Jesus Christ, belief in God, belief in eternity, or belief in nothing. And he, like say a Francis Schaeffer, if you're familiar with Francis Schaeffer, he believes in following a given philosophy to its conclusion. So when we think of Dostoevsky, he's writing on atheism. He's writing on the consequences of atheism. Where does that philosophy lead you? Now, anyone who's familiar with our work will know that I debated Christopher Hitchens, that I moderated debates between Richard Dawkins and John Lennox and Dinesh D'Souza and Michael Shermer, a guy that I also debated. I debated atheists and Muslims on CNN and Al Jazeera and so forth. So this is a topic that I feel very passionate about. It's one that we've devoted an awful lot of our time to, and that's fairly personal for me. And that's because when I was quite young, high school age, I was thinking on these issues quite deeply, and I had come to the conclusion, in the words of the great philosophers, Kansas, that we're all just dust in the wind. That all your money won't another minute buy. I had decided that the logical conclusion of there not being a God meant that there was no meaning in life. And you can imagine how I responded to Dostoevsky when I read him as a young man, because here was somebody wrestling with the very questions that I was wrestling with, but a century before me. So Dostoevsky's book, these themes run right through them. I'll tell you something else about Dostoevsky that fascinates me. They both had the same agent, and they were both publishing in the same magazine serially at the same time, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Imagine that. Imagine that. They were both recognized, certainly, as especially Tolstoy, as great authors in their own time. But now, as we look back at that, can you imagine if you are the agent or publisher who has both of them? And Dostoevsky and Tolstoy never met. A.N. Wilson, a biographer, says if the two of them had met, they surely would have killed each other. And what's so fascinating about that is that they were both fairly similar. Both of them were Christians in the broad sense of the word. You can argue about whether or not they ultimately believed the four spiritual laws and so on. You can research that for yourself, but they both certainly considered themselves to be Christians, and definitely theists who believed in Jesus Christ. And they were both hot-tempered. And both of them, a theme that runs through their writing is their struggle with the flesh. Their struggle with the flesh. So if you've read much of the Brothers Karamazov, you know that this theme is very real, and I would hope it would be something that you would identify with in your own life. I find it very interesting that the Brothers Karamazov was published in 1881, and two other classic works written after 1881 that are they don't attain the same level of greatness as the Brothers Karamazov, but nonetheless are fascinating, is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, which deals with, on one level it's science fiction, but Robert Louis Stevenson was dealing with a very real. That was the issue of our evil. And so Dr. Jekyll, the good Dr. Jekyll, detests the evil that is within himself, and he develops a potion, a formula, where he drinks something and he's hoping to separate out, like oil and water, his evil nature from his good nature, and then he will isolate and destroy, like cancer cells, the evil part of his nature. Only it doesn't work, and everything goes very badly. Another one is Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, written in the late 1890s, I think. And Oscar Wilde, who was a homosexual, was arrested for an affair that he had with another man. Homosexual at that time was illegal, and suffered great public censure and embarrassment. And the Picture of Dorian Gray is a fascinating story of a man who is struggling with his own evil nature. He finds himself going to the wicked part of town to engage in nefarious activities, and every time he does it, he looks at the portrait of himself, and the portrait is marred. So these are themes that Dostoevsky was ahead of them on in dealing with this. And so both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were both struggling with this aspect of man's nature and man's character. I want to be good, but I can't be good. And what I'm sure both of them knew very well, particularly Dostoevsky, since he had to read the New Testament, is this is what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 7. That which I would do, I don't do. And that which I do is what I don't want to do. These are things that all of us, at least I hope all of us, can identify with this. They also had a similar view of of women. In their books, women are generally fairly one-dimensional. They lack depth. Usually, there's a couple of characters in the Brothers Karamazov, women who are given a little bit more depth. But if you read Tolstoy's War and Peace, Tolstoy spends an awful lot of time discussing the physical descriptions of the women in his novels, and for the most part, they're just wallflowers. They're just parlor conversation and to tempt men. Both of them saw women as the sirens, or if you've seen "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" Sirens that are beckoning men to their destruction. I think I've got another one here who's trying to join. Yes. So anyway, so these are major themes that you find in their writing that are quite fascinating. The Brothers Karamazov itself is superficially it's a murder mystery. It's a Columbo episode. It's a Murder, She Wrote, or Monk, or something like that, where we're trying to figure out who did it. But that's only superficially. The book is far more profound than that. You have the three brothers, rather four brothers, I should say, three, and then the fourth I put brackets around because he's not revealed later into the book. And their wicked father, Fyodor. And Fyodor really is an evil character in this. He's been a lousy father. He has two dead wives. He doesn't care about his children at all. And he takes a kind of wicked pleasure in seeing them fight with one another. But the brothers are Dmitri, who is the eldest by the first wife. And each of them embodies, by the way, some hyper characteristic of human beings. This is just the way he's developed them. But Dmitri is the oldest brother, and he's the sensualist. Whatever feels good, he does it. Dmitri is all about wine, women, song, fighting, brawling, boozing, you name it, he does it. Then you have Ivan and Alyosha, in that order. Alyosha is the youngest. Dmitri's 28, and I don't recall how old Ivan is, but Alyosha is 20, and they're by the second mother, and they both know each other reasonably well. And Ivan is the intellectual and the atheist. He's an author. He's publishing, as I do, and in a variety of periodicals and so on. And Alyosha is he's the spiritual one. Zosima, the priest in this novel, is Dostoevsky's Christ figure, but Alyosha is his perfect Christian. And he's a hero of the story. Though I will tell you that Dostoevsky intended, as I say, this to be a trilogy, and it was his intention to make Dmitri the hero in the end. That never happened, but you get glimpses of it towards the end of this novel. And so again, Dmitri, the sensualist, Ivan, the intellectual and atheist, and Alyosha, the tender-hearted spiritual one, the Christian, the one who's gone off to join the monastery. And then later it's revealed to us that there's a fourth brother, and that brother is Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov is a servant in the home, and they've always thought that that's just what he was, is just a servant in their father's home, but he's actually an illegitimate child. And Smerdyakov is the embodiment of evil. He is the embodiment of all evil. Now, the thesis of the book is given to us by Ivan in a conversation where the whole family is gathered with Zosima, the priest, in a kind of family counseling situation. They're seeking resolution to some major family divisions that are going on between brothers and their father over money and romance. Dmitri, I think it's Dmitri and Fyodor, the father, both are interested in the same woman. And Dmitri has a quarrel with his father for money that his father owes him, that was left by their mother to him, that he's not received. And while they're sitting there around, we've all been in these circumstances. You're sitting with someone you want to impress. You're on your best behavior. The whole family is trying to not embarrass themselves, with the exception of Fyodor, who doesn't mind humiliating everyone at any given moment. But there's a fellow there named Mayusov, which, interestingly enough, Dostoyevsky refers to as a typical European liberal. It's quite funny, and he describes him as someone who likes people in general, just not in the specific. Now, this is actually quite a fascinating statement that he makes in describing him, because I think this fits with modern time so well. Those Christians who like sinners in the abstract, they just don't actually want to meet any of them. They like to put, if you're broken, come to this church. We love sinners here, but they don't actually want to meet any of them. And there are those people who I would suggest to you that we see an awful lot of it in the Democratic Party, who speak of a love of mankind in the general, but think of nothing of annihilating the unborn in the specific. I mean, this is the kind of thing that is going on in our society in a very big way. I mean, and yet Alyosha is an individual who loves real people. He rolls up his sleeves and he gets into their lives to help them. And really helping people, those of you who have done it, I'm sure many of you who are listening in on me this evening, know that that's a messy proposition. Ministry is a messy proposition. Helping your neighbor is a messy proposition. It means getting into their lives and allowing them into yours. And it's not always comfortable. It's not always what we want. And so he describes Mayusov as this kind of typical liberal, an individual, and that's, again, those are his words, not mine, as an individual who likes man in the abstract, just not in the specific. And he really dislikes Ivan. And he's trying to embarrass Ivan with the priest, with Zosima. So he says that Ivan, you see, he's trying to embarrass Ivan. So he says that Ivan writes in all these magazines, and he says all these outrageous, offensive things about the church. And one of them that he says is, if there is no immortality, there can be no virtue, and all things are permissible. Now, that is the thesis of this book. And that's so profound, and I want to repeat it. If there is no immortality, there can be no virtue, and all things are permissible. Let me translate that. Let me bring it down, as a friend of mine says, where the goats can get it. If there is no God, there's no absolute right and wrong, and you can do whatever you can get away with. That's what he's saying. And so the priest turns to Ivan and says, did you say this? Is this what you believe? And he says that he does believe it. And in this very key moment, Dmitri sits forward, and Dmitri's not an intellectual. And he says, excuse me, did you say if there isn't a God, we can do whatever we want? And he says, yeah, I did say that. And Dmitri, it's a moment that the author is underscoring for us, says, I'll remember that. And he sits back. And it is from there that the story goes. Now, if you follow me on Twitter, Twitter is, golly, it's a brawl on Twitter. Some of the outrageous things people say. But yesterday, there's a guy who follows me, a Canadian journalist, a homosexual activist by the name of Rob Gill. And Rob yesterday tweeted, I don't know him personally, it's just he follows me and I see his tweets. And he tweeted, do you remember exactly how I said what his words were? His words were, I hope that at some point that a member of the Secret Service will go rogue on Trump. Now that, to me, was suggesting assassination of the President of the United States. When you saw the people in his tweet line, people who follow him, their response to what he was, that's precisely how a number of them took it too, and one of them said something like, I've been afraid to say this for a very long time, and I'm against violence, but in this case, it might be the best solution. So I highlighted this and I retweeted it, and I said, so we're now advocating assassination of the President of the United States. And of course, he immediately said, that is the journalist, he said, no, that's not at all what I was saying. I was just saying, I hope one of them rats him out. They see what he does. Now, whether or not you like Trump, that isn't the point. The point, rather, is that he was providing a kind of justification to someone else's behavior. It's a bit like if you've ever read T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. Henry II, the King Henry II is in conflict with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas à Becket, and he says this to his knights, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest? And what do? They look at each other and they see how they can score points with the king. They ride that very night to Canterbury Cathedral. They catch Becket in the cathedral and they kill him with their broadswords. And then Henry II says, whoa, this was not what I was trying to accomplish, you see. So I think that a tweet like that is dangerous and it's irresponsible because it's setting something loose in the behavior of other people who might be willing to put feet to it. You see something very similar in Alfred Hitchcock's movie Rope, where Jimmy Stewart plays a professor who theorizes with his students. I wonder if the perfect murder could be committed. And some of his students decide to act on his silly proposition. And they do go and commit one because it's figured out. That's what's happening in this book. When Ivan says, if there is no immortality, there can be no virtue and all things are permissible, and Dmitri sits forward and says, so you're saying if there's no God, we can do whatever we want. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And Dmitri takes note of it. Dostoevsky is leading us to believe that Dmitri is the one who kills the father. The father ends up dead, and all the circumstantial evidence sure points to Dmitri. He's been in a fight with his father. Money's missing, and he has money that he can't explain where he got it. He had been at the house. Someone had seen him jump over the back wall on the very night that his father was. It all looks like Dmitri. but it is. We later discover that it is Smerdyakov who murdered the father, who hated their father. He hates all mankind, but he idolizes Ivan. And just Dmitri had been listening to what Ivan was saying, Dmitri was listening to it as well. And so he confesses to Ivan, you know, Dmitri didn't do it. I killed him. And I'm a huge fan of your writing and the things you're saying. And I did it because of you. Because, as you said, if there isn't a God, there's no ultimate right and wrong, and I don't believe in one. So you're right. We can do whatever we want. Ivan, in that moment, realizes what he's done. He's full of guilt from father, not because he killed him with his own hand, but because he gave intellectual justification to his crazy brother's actions. Now, each of the brothers, the theme of guilt runs throughout this entire novel. And each of the brothers bear a kind of guilt. And that guilt is because each of them has thought about killing their father. They've all, time or another, all of them had a reason to kill him. And before I open this for a few questions, I'll get you, Zachary. Go ahead and unmute people so you can ask me some things here. I want to say something about some of the other themes that run through. And by the way, trying to do the Brothers Karamazov in an hour is a bit like trying to put a battleship in a glass bottle. It's very, very difficult. But what I'm hoping to do is kind of tease some themes that really get you thinking and maybe make you want to go and read this book if you haven't, or perhaps reconsider it if you. But again, the themes of nature versus will. You know, is it? I think it's Dawkins who says that we all dance to the tune of our own DNA. You know, so 100 years before Dawkins ever made a statement like that, well, Dostoevsky was wrestling with that very same theme, because running through this novel is the theme of our own wicked natures. He talks about the Karamazov nature in this, that each of these brothers, they all have this wicked gene, as it were, that they all carry, and they can't help but do the things that they do. But the Bible argues that wicked gene is in all of us. It's not just a particular family. Well, it is running through a particular family, the descendants of Adam. It runs through all of us. And we have a bent towards evil. This is Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 21. This is the what Augustine called original sin. Each of us is polluted with it. And we're not absolutely depraved. That is to say, we're not as evil as we can be at every single moment, but we are totally depraved in the sense that we're cut off from God by our own sin. You know, it's interesting to me that Jesus, explaining to the disciples how to pray, he refers to the disciples as evil. He says, now you who are evil. I mean, that's interesting. These are the guys who are on the outsides of our cathedrals and, you know, murals on the wall and, you know, depicted with halos and things of this nature. And Jesus referred to them as evil. So it is with us. And we're always struggling, like Jekyll and Hyde, with that evil nature. It's not that we have a bent towards doing good that we have to restrain. Gosh, I have so much good in me that I have to restrain myself from giving away all of my money. That's not the way it works. It's the opposite. We have to restrain our evil impulses. And as I argued in The Grace Effect and later again in The Faith of Christopher Hitchens, this was an argument that I used against Christopher Hitchens, because if we accept that man is by nature evil, which he did, by the way, which is very interesting from an atheistic point of view, then the question becomes, what will restrain that nature and keep us from being as evil as we might otherwise be? Well, for Dostoevsky, for many of you who are listening to me this evening, as Jesus Christ. And I'm with Evelyn Waugh, the author Evelyn Waugh, who someone told him he was an awful person. And he said, you have no idea how much more awful I would be if it weren't for the fact that I'm a Christian. That's the way I feel. I'm very aware of my own sinfulness. I'm very aware of my own wicked tendencies, my wicked thoughts. And I can only imagine how much worse I would be if it were not for the restraint of the Holy Spirit, were it not for Christ in my life, in the presence of other Christians in my life. And so this was a theme that Dostoevsky struggled with. He struggled with this terribly because Dostoevsky felt tremendous guilt about his own wicked nature. And how do we fight that? And then there's this whole theme of suffering that runs through this book, and faith and doubt, and then the issue of socialism. Zachary, can you unmute people? Can you hear me, Zach?
Yeah. Do you want me to unmute everybody?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. They're unmuted.
All right, you are unmuted. So please don't put anything pornographic on my screen or do anything horrible here that offends our listeners. But ask me questions.
But the night before that, or two nights, I went to bed at 3.
Maybe we didn't do this right because I think I'm hearing too many people all at once.
Hey, mute everybody back.
And what do we do? Somebody raises their hand, perhaps?
Anybody, anytime someone wants to talk, they just have to hold the space bar and talk. I'm going to leave them muted until they do that.
Okay. Could they hear you say that, Zachary?
Yes.
Okay.
So you want to talk, press the space bar, but otherwise I'm going to keep everybody muted.
Otherwise, I hear your children, your dog, arguments, anything else that is going on in your house. I think I actually even heard a toilet earlier, so I'm glad it's you and not me. Any questions? By the way, it's okay if you haven't read the book. I'm not trying, I don't want to embarrass anybody, so feel free to ask any questions. Well, until someone does, let me just offer you a couple of more themes here that I think are quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think there's one here.
Oh, you've got someone?
Yes, someone just is right here. Go ahead, Rob.
Hi, Larry. Hang on a sec. In New Zealand here?
Yes. Glad to have you on, Rob. You say you're in New Zealand. North Island or South Island?
Partway up the North Island.
Beautiful.
Palmerston North. I read your book, Christopher Hitchens' book, which I really enjoyed. But what I was just going to ask you very quickly was the quote often attributed to Dostoevsky, I think that's what we're talking about here. Sorry, I missed the first part of your talk, was this quote. Then
You're
all
cutting
things
out
are,
on me, Rob.
If there's no God, then all things are permissible.
Yes, that's correct. That's a thesis of this particular novel.
Yeah. I know there is some dispute about whether he said that or not.
No, he absolutely said it. And let me find it, which might take more time than is wise here. But yes, he does say it. I'll just tell you where it is. It's in the meeting with Father Zosima at the monastery. And Dostoevsky says it through the character Ivan. And it depends on your translation. The one that I'm using here is the Larissa Volokonsky translation, which is deemed to be one of the very best. I know that many of you probably have the Constance Garnett translation, which is also a very popular one and very good. But it comes out more or less as if there is no immortality, there can be no virtue, and all things are permissible.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure. Anything else?
No, there's phones ringing in the background, so I better go.
Okay, go ahead. All right, other questions?
Just wondered about the translation that you just mentioned. Which one?
Yes, well, I'll hold it here to the camera so you can see it maybe you can Larissa
Oh,
Volokhonsky.
yeah. That's the one I have. It's a
Yeah,
different.
that's a newer one. And it's slightly more nuanced translation, particularly when it comes to the book Demons, which is usually translated as The Possessed. Other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear someone.
Oh, it's Thurlow.
Hey, that's
from,
my buddy Thurlow.
How you doing?
I'm good. Where are you?
I am in Newport Beach, California.
Good for you.
Yeah, nice.
Fire away, buddy.
I just got halfway through. I'm only on chapter 8, but it's funny when you mention that when he makes that comment, and so this is a turning point of the book, basically.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It's that if it were a movie, it would be the part that after he says it, there would be dun-dun-dun, there would be dramatic music.
So this is an intro. Do we talk about it again after this, or?
Well, I hadn't planned on it, but if there's a great demand for that, I suppose we could. What I would say to you, those of you who are out there, listen, my version of the book is basically 800 pages, 796 pages. I would say to you, if you read the first 350 pages, you've read the Brothers Karamazov. and no, let me explain why I say that, Thurlow. It's because that's where the ideas are all developed. After that, you have to understand that this book was published serially. And, in the 19th century, authors did publish serially. And it's been to the ruin of it's ruined literature for many a middle schooler. Because
yes, I'm sure
all of us were forced to read, the big fat, Dickens, Great Expectations, and books like that were just way too long. And of course, they were paid either by the word or by installment. And so there was an incentive for them to make it longer. War and Peace is double the size of this. You can fill potholes with War and Peace.
It's a great idea for Chicago.
It is 1,500 pages, and it just doesn't need to be that long. But Tolstoy, though he was a member of the nobility, he had blown an awful lot of money, and he was publishing and getting paid with each installment. So this is the way things were frequently done. So if you make it through the first 350 pages, you have done very, very well and understand many of the major ideas that are being discussed and introduced there. I hope somebody will ask me a question about suffering.
The priest brings up. The priest kept bringing up suffering, but he always it wasn't a suffering that the people felt they were actually suffering from. It seems like they were suffering from something else.
You know what's interesting? What's interesting to me about that in this book, and I hope those of you who have read the book have picked up on this. I love Dostoevsky, I do, but when I get to heaven, I want to sit down with him and argue a point that he makes in this book where I think he's wrong. And that is, Dostoevsky clearly sees suffering as a means of purification of the soul. Dmitri, had there been the other two volumes of this that he intended to write, Dmitri was going to suffer an awful lot more. Dmitri, the novel ends with Dmitri escaping with Grushenka, the two of them going off to America, and he's going to suffer. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, that theme is there too. And the problem I have with this is that Dostoevsky sees it as a means of kind of sort of sweating off your sins, kind of paying for them. And it nullifies the cross. You can't pay for your sins. I've often thought that I wish I could pay for my sins. I wish the Lord could, just text me and say, Larry, you go do this and we're even, we're good. You go and suffer for me in Africa or Asia, or you die for me, sharing the the gospel in some godforsaken part of the world, you and I, we're even. It's all good. And of course, the cross makes it very clear you can't do that. We have no means of, once Adam and Eve, once the fall took place, we had no means of having right relationship with Jesus Christ without Jesus Christ paying for our sins on the cross. So the idea that you can beat yourself with birch limbs, or that you can wear a camel hair coat and sleep on a bed of nails and make yourself utterly miserable, that this will make you somehow that you're earning God's favor with this, just simply isn't true. Now, that said, suffering, and I've known an awful lot of suffering in my own life, suffering will either make you better or bitter. Will either make, and meaning there is spiritual benefit that can certainly come from suffering. There's no guarantee of that. But there is for the Christian, if you submit yourself to Jesus Christ. Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good, not for everybody, but for those who are called according to his purposes. I've been with any number of non-Christians who'll say, well, everything works together for good, and it's not for you. You don't actually get to claim that unless you. But the idea that we can suffer and somehow kind of earn our salvation or God's faith, which is a theme in the Brothers Karamazov, is not biblically true. But that's a very Russian theme, by the way, Thurlow, and for all of you, it's a very Russian idea. The idea of suffering.
That was also what Martin Luther.
Who's speaking to me now?
This is Joey Henderson from
Joey, go ahead.
South Carolina.
Yes, sir.
That was the monkish order that Martin Luther was in to try to
Augustinian order.
Yeah, and he came to the same conclusion, I think.
Well, yes and no. If you read Luther isn't of the view that suffering that you'll earn your salvation. I mean, read his tour de force commentary on Galatians, which is absolutely if the rest of his works were to all burn, I would hope that his commentary on Galatians would survive, because it's just a tour de force on grace. But he also is quoted in his table talk, someone coming to him and saying, Dr. Luke, to enjoy good food. And he said something to this effect: well, I do believe if the Lord made good steaks and good wine, it's okay for me to eat them and to drink them. So I don't think he was an ascetic in the sense of a Dostoyevsky, that he believed that we should just suffer for the sake of suffering. And he certainly enjoyed marriage in violation of the Catholic view of celibacy and loads of children.
Well, actually, I was commenting that he came to the conclusion that the suffering was not.
Okay. My apologies.
Yeah.
My apologies. I'm total agreement.
Yeah.
I read the introduction in the book of that translation, and I really didn't get that impression at all. I don't know if you've read it recently, but I thought that the suffering, he actually came to Christ through this suffering and the prison. Dostoevsky did.
Dostoevsky, he did come to, I just mean in the novels themselves, it just strikes me, I'm just giving you my impression, that it always seems to me that the Russian view of suffering and its relationship to us spiritually is, sometimes misses the mark biblically, because we can't pay for our sins, but our suffering can, of course, mold our character, and it can draw us closer to Jesus Christ.
But isn't that kind of the, works? We kind of look at works as how we earn our salvation, and not, necessarily suffering. So it's kind of an angle on it too. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it's in our nature,
Right.
I think, just as I was saying a moment ago, I wish I could suffer for my sins. I wish I could pay for them. I wish I could do works for them. I wish that I would receive a list of things that, you do this and read it. Of course, it doesn't work that way. And it's because grace for us, at least for me, is very counterintuitive. It's very counterintuitive. It's hard for me to absorb the idea of grace.
Yeah. Well, it's
Any other questions for me?
The movie Mission had that theme.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. A very Catholic view being presented there of a Jesuit who's paying for his sins, or at least he thinks he is.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Hey, Larry.
Yes, I hear someone.
Chris here talking. Have you been to Russia recently? When was the last time you were in Russia? And I read Everything is Possible and Nothing is True, The Surreal Heart of the New Russia by Peter Pomerantsev. I'm not sure if you've heard of that book.
I'm not familiar with the book. The last I was in Russia was in 2017. I've been there many times. And Russia is a fascinating country, and Russian literature is fascinating to me. Have you been there yourself?
No. It's on my bucket.
Yeah, go sometime.
It's on
be
my
careful
bucket
where
list.
Be careful where you go and where you stay. But Russia's a fascinating country. I'll give you this little literary tidbit. Americans have a hard time generally identifying with Russian authors, but Russian authors themselves generally identify with Southern American authors. That is Faulkner, for instance. If you're familiar with Faulkner and you've read Faulkner, it's very similar to Russian literature, and it's because the South, at least the South of, the South until really quite modern times, has had a history of suffering. It's also had a history of some backwardness, and it has produced a pearl of great literature. The South has, and Russians identify with that. And the Russia, I recall one woman saying to me that Russia is like a child, like one of your own children who's not good at something. You just love it that much more. Russia is a country, the Industrial Revolution, the early rumblings of the Industrial Revolution began in England in the 1740s. It did not hit Russia until the second of the 5-year plans in the 1930s. Now think about that. So roughly 200 years behind the rest of the world. We think of Americans having won World War II with the landings at D-Day. Our total casualties and wounded number about 600,000 in World War II. The Russians lost roughly 25 million people in that war. Think of that. That's the level of suffering. Stalin is said to have killed as many as 60 million people. So the Russians have known extraordinary suffering, and it's a fascinating country. I've led a number of tour groups there. I've been there on my own a few times for a variety of reasons. Someday I want to take the Trans-Siberian Railway all the way across Russia and make that an interesting riding project. But the Russian people are a fascinating people. A little bit like New Yorkers in the sense that externally they can be really quite brusque, but are some of the most hospitable people you will ever meet. Any other questions? Well, I do hope that you've all enjoyed it, and I do apologize for our technological gaffe getting started. I had a feeling this was coming because I'd never done one of these Zoom meetings, and my guys got us all set up on this, and Philip sent out the lovely email announcing it all, and it seems that somehow I must have altered that code or done something. So I'll just throw myself under the bus and say that it's something that I must have done wrong. But if you've enjoyed it, please let us know, and we'll schedule something like this again I hope you're all safe in quarantine, and that we have so many of you who are from all over the world who are listening this evening. I would like to share with you something on another topic, which is a book that I have coming out this fall called Around the World in More Than 80 Days, What Makes America Great and Why We Must Save It. And it's based on my travels to 55 countries and basically doing a reverse Alexis de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville came to America, the French political philosopher, and discover the greatness of America. Well, I went to the world to look at what the world was like and to see what we can learn from that, and where is America behind America great. I also like to discuss what I hope will be another book fairly soon, which is our need for what I believe is a new apologetic. I think that we as Christians are actually quite far behind. We're using very outdated strategies for a globalization that has moved on several notches from the strategies that we were all taught. And I think that we're 50 years or even a century behind where the Cold actually is, and we're ill prepared to engage. And the result of that is that we're seeing our views being driven from the culture. So we'll perhaps schedule that as a conversation sometime too. But that marks the end of our evening. I hope you'll all have a lovely rest of your, and next time we'll endeavor to do this much better. Thank you so much for joining.
Larry.
Yes.
I just want to, this is Joey from South Carolina.
Yes, sir.
I just want to say, probably for everybody, how much I really appreciate you, all the work you do. I don't to get information about what's going on in politics, what's happening around the world. You're one of the few I do. I appreciate you being out there, helping me get good information. I appreciate your ministry. Thank you, to John Lennox. All the debates that I watched were amazing. All that you've written has been great. I cannot read enough of your stuff, but you have opened me up to things that I would have never known about or been able to. So I just thank you for your ministry, and just really appreciate you being so
much, Joey, and let me add to that. John Lennox will be one of these discussions too. So
awesome.
I'm about
Larry,
to. I'm supposed to be doing a discussion with him very soon.
Larry, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can.
Oh, good. Really, I agree with everything that was just been said, but one thing I need is something from Zach. If maybe the last Zoom meeting I went to, when I signed up, they said you can turn on your camera with a little box. Before I got into the meeting, it said,
I'll tell you what,
okay?
let's discuss that off air so we don't keep everyone else here hanging.
Zach can maybe work that out.
Yeah. I'm sure someone will be able to figure that out for you, but you're local, so we'll be able to handle that. Thank you so much. I hope you've all enjoyed this evening.
Larry, I know that Zachary said he was recording it, so I'm wondering if we can watch it later.
Yeah, I think so. At least I hope so. There's something over here beeping that says it's recording.
We have it recorded.
I don't know where that's going, but
you'll get a notification after it's done, and you can upload it.
Perfect.
Okay. Perfect.
We'll e-blast it.
That's great.
Philip, that guy right up there on my screen, he will do that for you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.